For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
Hello and welcome. If you thought that the Indian Air Force has carried out only one trans-border operation in the past 40 years, then one must rethink. While operation in Balakot was a very tense and a very difficult operation to destroy terrorist camp inside Pakistan in February 2019, there was another trans-border operation that the Indian Air Force carried out exactly 34 years ago this week, and that was in Sri Lanka. This is the topic that I'm going to discuss in this week's Simply Nitin. I'm Nitin Gokhale. So before we talk about what the Indian Air Force did under Operation Poomalai or Operation Garland, one must talk about the situation in Sri Lanka in those years and especially in 1987. To be precise, on 26th May 1987, the Sri Lankan Armed Forces launched what is called Operation Vadamarachi or Operation Liberation to liberate the Jaffna Peninsula, which was then under the control of the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam. And the Sri Lankan Armed Forces wanted to reclaim that part of Sri Lanka from the Tamil rebels or Tamil insurgents under the guidance of Vellupillai Prabhakaran, who was the supreme leader of the LTTE even that time. Now, while the operation was launched by the Sri Lankan Armed Forces on 26th May 1987, there was tremendous pressure on Sri Lanka to stop that operation by international agencies, by other countries, but more so by India. That time, Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi and, of course, the Chief Minister of Tamil Nadu, that time M.G. Ramachandran. The Tamils in India were in sympathy with the Tamils in Sri Lanka, who had a majority in the Jaffna Peninsula, while the Sri Lankan Armed Forces wanted to reclaim that area from the control of the LTTE. The Tamils in Sri Lanka were under pressure, although they had sympathies from the Tamils in India and the Indian government under Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi, who had a brute majority in parliament between late 1984 and 1989. In 1987, Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi had warned Sri Lanka, or in fact Sri Lankan President J.R. Jayawardene, that India will not remain a mute spectator if Sri Lanka did not halt what India then called a operation that was going against the civil population in Jaffna, and also was seen as human rights violation of the Sri Lankan Tamils, especially in the Jaffna Peninsula. The Sri Lankan government was not in a mood to listen to anyone, least of all India at that time, because they were suffering bombings and they were suffering killings from the LTTE and other insurgent organizations or terrorist organizations in Sri Lanka, and they were determined to wrest back Jaffna Peninsula. Now, this was becoming also a humanitarian crisis in Jaffna Peninsula because the Sri Lankan forces had surrounded the Jaffna Peninsula and had sealed off Jaffna Peninsula, where supplies were not allowed to go in, or no other medical aid or medical facilities were allowed to be taken into Jaffna. The people, the common people were starving. They were running low on supplies, and therefore, not only India but the entire world was concerned about what was happening in Jaffna. India, being the next door neighbor and also intertwined with the politics of Tamil Nadu, was compelled to act. So on 1st of June, Indians tried to send a flotilla of ships, civilian ships, to Jaffna Peninsula, to northern Sri Lanka, carrying essential supplies, food, kerosene, medicines, and other stuff for the Sri Lankan Tamils who were cut off from the mainland of Sri Lanka and had no way of getting any supplies or replenishment from elsewhere because the Sri Lankan forces had surrounded that area. while India tried that ships getting the flotilla of ships getting to the northern Sri Lankan area, the Sri Lankan Navy prevented that flotilla from being going into the northern peninsula. In fact, the media people who had accompanied the flotilla, the Indian media people from Tamil Nadu, most of them, were witness to the tense negotiations that happened between the Sri Lankan uh, Navy as well as the civil authorities from Tamil Nadu who had taken the supplies for Sri Lankan Tamils. While the flotilla returned after a couple of hours of negotiation without delivering the supplies, India was left with no option but to now show strength and ram through uh, a show of strength launched by the Indian Air Force the next day. Operation Poomalai was launched on 4th of June by the Indian Air Force. It was meant to be a signal, it was meant to be a message to Sri Lanka that if Sri Lankan forces were not withdrawn from Jaffna and the operation not halted, the military operation, then India will be forced to act. So, what happened in Operation Poomalai? So, as the operation commenced from Bangalore, where the AN-32s were then headed towards northern Sri Lanka, escorted by the Mirage aircraft, which had come from Gwalior all the way, because that is where the Gwalior, the base of the Mirage is even now. In fact, operation in Balakot also took place under the same squadron, which escorted AN-32s to Sri Lanka. Uh, in Delhi, Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi, his closest advisors, the air chief, and the core group, which was looking after the Sri Lankan operations, were all present at the operations room of the Indian Air Force, almost reminiscent of what happened in 2011 when President Obama, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, all the top White House officials were present when operations were launched to nab or kill Osama bin Laden in Abbottabad, inside Pakistan. That famous photograph, of course, is well publicized, but there is no photograph of Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi and others in the operations room. But the moments were as tense, I'm sure, because the operation has been described in great detail by Air Marshal Bharat Kumar in this book called Operation Pawan, role of Airpower with IPKF. I'll come to the IPKF, what IPKF is or was in a moment. But as the operation commenced, there were on the AN-32, there were a group of Indian and international media persons were also boarded from Bangalore so that they could see to themselves or see for themselves what India was trying to do. It was a very easy operation in a way at the end because there was no resistance from the Sri Lankan Air Force. They were already told that this was going to happen. In any case, the Sri Lankan Air Force wasn't a match to the firepower of the Indian Mirages that were escorting the AN-32. The AN-32s went to northern Sri Lanka, dropped the essential supplies. Many of the supplies were sort of wasted in a way because there was no dropping zones. They were just being distributed randomly over the skies in northern Sri Lanka, especially the Jaffna Peninsula. And of course, without any incident, the AN-32s came back. The Mirages landed back in Bangalore, and then, of course, they came back to Gwalior. But the importance of Operation Poomalai was not in how much aid was received by the Tamils in Sri Lanka. The importance then, given the geopolitical context and the regional context of tension between India and Sri Lanka, a strong message went across to Colombo, to Sri Lanka, and President J.R. Jayawardene realized that his government cannot resist the Indian pressure. The Operation Vadamarachi was called off immediately by President Jayawardene, and it led finally to what is called the Indo-Sri Lanka Agreement of 29 July 1987, where the Indian Prime Minister and President J.R. Jayawardene, Indian Prime Minister, of course, was Rajiv Gandhi, and President J.R. Jayawardene signed the Indo-Sri Lanka Agreement to try and bring peace to northern areas of Sri Lanka to the Tamil-dominated areas of Sri Lanka. The LTTE was also on board, at least it seems so, at the time of signing of that accord. It's another matter that things went south from there. Not much later, India inducted what was called the Indian Peacekeeping Force. The 54 Division of the Indian Army led the initial troops that went into northern Sri Lanka. As the name suggests, IPKF was the Indian Peacekeeping Force. But eventually, Vellupillai Prabhakaran, the leader of LTTE, went back on his promise to disarm all the LTTE cadres and agree to the terms that were signed or that were agreed upon by India and Sri Lanka. And the Indian peacekeeping force actually had to turn into Indian peace enforcers or peace keeping force that turned into force that was now forced to implement the accord or at least try and gain control of the territory where the LTT was dominant, and eventually it turned out to be a bloodbath. The IPKF suffered heavily, and rest is, as they say, a very sad history in the history of the Indian Armed Forces. That's a different episode one can talk about. But Operation Poomalai was smooth. It went through absolutely smoothly. And it sent out a message to Sri Lanka that India is a larger neighbor and India's wish will have to be accommodated. And India's wish was in keeping with the Tamils' wish in Sri Lanka and the wish of Tamil people and Tamil politicians in Tamil Nadu. It's a very complex history, cannot be explained in a 15 or 20-minute episode. But what I wanted to bring to your attention was Operation Poomalai, which was, in a way, very symbolic of India's rising status and rising military power at that point in time. Around the same time, you will remember, within a year or so, the Indian Air Force, the Indian paratroopers went into Maldives and carried out an operation to rescue then President of Maldives, who was taken hostage by mercenaries who wanted to overthrow him that time. Again, that's another episode one can talk about or have discussions on in Simply Nitin. But Operation Poomalai was in a way a breakthrough. And I wanted to also tell you that Mirages, which acted as escorts, armed escorts to AN-32 that time, are still in service. They are the ones who bombed the Balakot camp in Pakistan in February 2019. It's a long history. If you want more details, of course, it's available on internet. But this book by Air Marshal Bharat Kumar gives out a lot of details about what India did and how Operation Poomalai was planned and executed. Apart from what the Indian Air Force did in Operation Pawan, which was the name of the operation that the IPKF was involved in. It was there for 3 years. It had to come back rather disgraced because neither the Sri Lankan army, the Sri Lankan government, nor the Indian government as a whole could really give a clear direction to the IPKF, the Indian forces which were inducted into the Sri Lankan conflict, the ethnic conflict that was on. And that was one of the setbacks that the Indian military suffered in the late part of the 80s. Of course, it then came out of it. But that was something that a lot of lessons were brought home, a lot of lessons were learned. India lost over 1,200 soldiers in Sri Lanka that time under the IPKF. But the prelude to IPKF was something that I wanted to talk about because this is the week in which the entire action, the planning and the execution of Operation Poomalai took place. And it will go down in the history of the subcontinent as an important landmark because that showed that India was willing to push the envelope when it came to the neighbors. It actually violated the sovereignty and integrity of Sri Lanka. But as I said, the causes were thought to be important, and India wanted to show its military power as well as its determination to get a solution to the Tamil problem in Sri Lanka. It's another matter that it took another 22 years for the civil war to end in Sri Lanka, which ended in May 2009 when Elam War 4 came to an end with a violent death of Velupillai Prabhakaran and his closest commanders and associates. But that's all I have this week. You know where to reach us, give feedback, give comments, and of course, our social media handles are always there for you to follow and subscribe. And do press the bell icon to keep updated on the latest programs on StratNews Global. I'm Nitin Gokhale.